right, thank you for those of you who are attending our event this evening, Headlines Around the Globe. This event is a part of this year's Tech Talk series that is put on every year by Indiana Tech. So before I introduce our panelists today, I just want to introduce the Tech Talk series and give a little bit more information about what the series involves. So the series is a collaboration between Indiana Tech's academics and student affairs departments. The purpose of this series, which centers on a yearly theme, and this year's theme is globalization, is to promote active dialogue and awareness about important issues of social justice around the globe. Through the series, the university hopes to foster a sense of campus community and acceptance, promote critical thinking about the historical and social context of contemporary social challenges, raise awareness of global issues impacting the development of a just society, educate students on the ways in which global issues can be addressed through a variety of professional disciplines, engage the campus and the greater Fort Wayne community in joint dialogue on issues of justice, and finally, educate students on the role of empathy with who's impacted by social injustice in the promotion of a civil society. So as I said, this event is one of many events that the Tech Talk series is holding this year, centered around the theme globalization. So to talk about the media and headlines around the globe today, we have several media panelists. Before I introduce them, I'd like to just introduce myself. I will be your moderator this evening. I'm Dr. Alyssa Ivanson. I'm the chair of the communication program here at Indiana Tech. And we have 5 media panelists with us today. First, here on my left is Brian Engelhart. Brian has worked at Indiana Tech since 2013, and in his current role as Vice President of Marketing and Communication, he leads the university's marketing and communication team, developing the strategies and tactics that connect Indiana Tech with prospective students, as well as alumni, corporate partners, and the community. Early in his career, though, he served as deputy campaign managers for congressional candidates and worked as a private consultant on state and national political campaigns in Washington, D.C. Brian has 30 years of experience in the advertising, marketing, public relations, and corporate communications industries. Next to Brian, we have Rebecca Green. Rebecca joined the WBOI staff in December 2017 and brought almost 2 decades of experience in print journalism, including 15 years as an award-winning reporter for the journal Gazette in Fort Wayne. She currently manages the news at WBOI. Originally a South Bend native, she is a graduate of Taylor University and resident of Northeast Indiana since the late 1990s. She has covered everything from homicides to hurricanes and the small stories in between that make up the fabric of a community. She is passionate about the importance of local news in guarding a strong democracy and tries to instill that belief in her students as an adjunct instructor of journalism at Huntington University. And then next to Rebecca, we have Alyssa Ivanson. Currently, Alyssa is the morning and noon anchor for Fort Wayne's WANE-15. She joined their team in January 2006 as a reporter and producer. Since then, her various roles included 8 years as weekend evening anchor and 2 years as the 15 Finds Out lead investigative reporter. Her work has been nominated for regional Emmy Awards 12 different times, and she's been awarded numerous awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, the Indiana Broadcasters Association, and the Indiana Associated Press. The AP named Alyssa Best Reporter 3 times. Next to Alyssa, we have Angelica Robinson. Angelica is a native of Dayton, Ohio, but for the last 5 years, she's called the Summit City her home. As a multimedia journalist at WANE-TV, she is responsible for all aspects of putting a news story together, including interviewing, shooting, and editing video. In 2018, she was promoted to lead investigative reporter. She's also an adjunct professor here at Indiana Tech, and she graduated from the University of Cincinnati with a bachelor's degree in communication, and then later obtained a master's in journalism at DePaul University in Chicago. And then finally, our last panelist is Sherry Skufca. Sherry has been editor of the journal Gazette for the past 5 years and has worked in other editorial positions for the York Daily Record, the Corona Norco Independent, AT Videotext, and the Advertiser Tribune. She has covered stories from government corruption to California earthquakes to 3 Mile Island. She said, and I quote, "In 43 years, there have been fewer than a handful of days when she didn't want to go to work, and she can't imagine doing anything else." Thank you very much, media panelists, for joining us today, providing your perspectives and expertise on headlines around the globe. So before we get to the headlines that were pulled from the globe, I want to give each panelist just a few minutes to talk about their experience, their perspectives of American politics, how they have worked with American politics, and how the media portrays American politics. So we'll go ahead and start with Brian.
Okay. Thank you, Alicia. You know, after you sent that question to us to think about before today, I really kind of thought back to the start of my career where I worked in electoral politics on the candidate side and the campaign side, where really my role was to be an advocate and to be an advocate for a political campaign, a candidate, a cause, a party in the midst of that. But really did get a close-up view of how the media interacts with not just that role, but with political campaigns in general. And that was really not too long after I got out of college, and I really learned a lot, not just about campaigning, but about the importance of the role of the media in that process. And that was in the early 90s, so it's been nearly 30 years since that happened, and certainly the media landscape has changed quite a bit. And, you know, as now more of an observer of politics, I do interact some with legislative initiatives that might intersect with Indiana Tech here as part of my role. But really what I've observed is really the changes in the media landscape that have driven a couple of trends that I've seen. One is anymore, I think what we're talking about today is really what you might refer to as the industry or the institution of the media. But I think we've all seen we're in an environment where individuals are themselves media in their own way. We're always sharing, we're always telling stories, we're always you know, issuing our opinions on social media. Many people have taken it upon themselves to form their own media outlets, for lack of a better term. And I think that has really sort of bent the curve of the conversation around what constitutes news, what constitutes media. And it's really impacted how we consume information related to politics in particular, but really every subject that we come across in the course of our lives, in the course of business, and the things that we do. So I think that by itself is, has been very impactful in terms of how conversations around politics happen. The second, I think, is you've seen an unfortunate, really a hollowing out of what is a great American institution, and that is the media. It's one of the things that has, throughout our history, kept us free, enabled free dialogue, and really enabled average citizens to know what's happening with their government. And I think those two things are intertwined, certainly, over the last couple decades in particular. But I think you start to see the impact of that in both of those things, in the way things tend to be covered and consumed these days. And, you know, so I think we as consumers have been conditioned to the quick take, the hot take, you know, what's happening right now, rather than overarching trends, rather than things that might allow us to pull back and make better decisions collectively, and drive change that might impact our nation in a better way. And, you know, I think of an example that's going on now, that's much in the news, and that's the Supreme Court confirmation hearings that just started today. And obviously that's been much in the news for a variety of reasons. But I think one of the things that has gotten lost in that, and one of the things that you don't see as often that you might have in previous times, has been there's not been a lot of conversation about really what's driving the intensity of a situation like that. And there's a lot of political reasons that do that, but there's a lot of reasons that have to do with the way that Americans have been choosing to dedicate their attention and consume media. And I think the one thing that we're missing in that is a story that would be more suited to more of an in-depth look at how things have gotten the way they are. And that is, when you look at the three institutions that make up our federal government, the executive, the judiciary, and the congressional branch, the legislative branch, we've really gotten to a point where we're expecting two of those branches to do more and one of those branches to do less, and we're accepting of that. And the Supreme Court was not made to be a legislative body. But I think by both choice and by the intensity and the distillation of political opinion in our country that has been driven in a large part by some of these trends, we're starting to see that everything is all or nothing. Everything is winner take all. And in a properly functioning American system, each of the branches of government are co-equal, and they have an equal role, but different role. And I think it's been almost an abdication of congressional duty and responsibility in this country, where really the intention of that system is for the congressional branch, the legislative branch, to develop systems and develop laws that are going to reflect a consensus. The legislative branch was designed to be the voice of the people, particularly the House of Representatives. The Senate was a bit more for the states to have equal representation. The President was meant to execute the laws faithfully, and the judicial branch is meant to adjudicate disputes that arise within that. More and more, we're seeing that the legislative branch is meant as a rubber stamp of the executive branch for either party. You know, it's a winner-take-all. We must win control of the House and the Senate to have any hope of any of our priorities happening. And the judicial branch is seen as the validation of that or the striking down of things that we don't agree with. And that's not really how that was meant to function. And I think some of these things have really come to the fore in terms of how we consume media. I think, again, due to some of the things that people have started to take for granted over too many years, the role that an independent media plays and can play in really examining that and calling to that to the fore and helping people understand the impact of that. So it might have been more than 5 minutes, but that's sort of how I've experienced the intersection of both media and politics, both in my career and just my personal interest.
Thank you, Brian. Rebecca?
So when I talk to my classes at Huntington University, one of the things that I have said to them every single semester I teach the class is that when a society transitions from closed to open, the first thing that appears is a free press. It might be in the form of, you know, if we go back to the founding of this country, it would be pamphlets, handbills, things like that, small bits of information that were unfettered by government involvement, and that became the way the population understood what was going on. When a society transitions from open to closed, you see that begin in the constriction of the rights of the public to access information about what their government is doing. And I think in this country and in Western democracies in general, older ones particularly, we have this notion that it can't happen here phenomenon, that it is not something that we have to guard and protect. And I think one of the things that we have learned over the last probably even 10 or 15 years, no, I'm going to go further back than that, probably since the mid-1990s, is that when information becomes weaponized and fragmented, and you can begin to pick and choose the information that you like rather than the information that is correct, democracy begins to fray at the edges. And what we are seeing now, where we have an administration that is often openly advocating for the jailing of opposition, for the press is the enemy of the state, when you have physical assaults on journalists doing their jobs at the local level by arms of the state, right, in law enforcement, and also people who just don't like journalists anymore. When you start to see that move into the more common, then we start to become more alarmed. We should be more alarmed. In order for democracy to function, more information is better. No one ever buys a house and doesn't look at in the inspection report. You don't do it. And the reason you don't do it is because it's negligent. If you don't know that your roof has a leak, you can't complain when you get wet if you didn't look at the report. And from your local newspapers to your local television stations to your local radio stations, all the way up to the international dailies of the New York Times, the BBC, etc., the information that they give the citizens of the United States and the globe help us make decisions about who to vote for, where to send our kids to school, whether it's safe to eat out right now, on a very personal, local level, and then on a global level, where to organize, where we might want to put a business, where we might want to do business or trade, etc. And I think for me, as a journalist, having covered the very small, the micro, the smallest towns in Northeast Indiana, their town councils, and seeing the lack of that coverage diminish over time, I think we just, because of a variety of reasons I'm sure Sherry can get into when it's her turn, that's no fault of anybody's. But now we're able, because we have the lack of free information and more information, we're seeing the weaponization of information. And I think, for me, it's a great concern because an uninformed populace is an unprepared populace. Again, if you don't read that inspection report, you don't know. If you don't know, if you don't have access to that information, imagine buying a house and they don't give you an inspection report. I believe that's illegal, and the reason that's illegal is because, or should be, because you need to know. You need to make those decisions. And now people choose not to read that. They choose not to know what their representative is doing. They choose not to know what their government is doing or what the business is putting in the water. And part of the reason they choose not to know is in fact because I think we're bombarded with all of the information that feels good, right? We get a lot of information that is dessert. Lots of dessert, not a lot of dinner. We're not getting the broccoli. We're not getting that information, the healthy stuff that we need to make democracy better. So when we become unsophisticated consumers of news or when we become lazy consumers of information, then we are more easily targeted, and I'm sure we're going to get into some of this later, by some of those news outlets and organizations. And I'm using news extremely loosely because I would not put them in my ranking of legitimate members of the Fourth Estate here or globally. But those are the kind of things that, I guess, for me, that's the stuff that keeps me up at night, is how can I, as a local journalist and a person who's active on social media within my own social circle, how can I encourage people to be better informed? How can I help provide them with the information that they need on a daily basis to live their lives better?
Thank you. Thank you. Alyssa.
Yeah, hi. So I was going to just share a little of my experience covering politics here locally with WANE-TV. And, you know, people like to hear what they want to hear, a little of what Rebecca's saying, that our script will say one thing and they will call complaining about something that was not in the script. And that has only gotten worse. And we always want to be fair and balanced, and when I would do political stories, that was just magnified to me, to the point where I would time out the sound bites, the amount of interview that each candidate got in my story. So they can't complain that I was in favor of this or in favor of that candidate. No, you each got 45 seconds on TV tonight. And it's also very important as a journalist because I might interview you for 10, 15 minutes, and then you're getting on TV for a minute. So I know what your intention was in that soundbite, in that interview, and I need to make sure that I convey your side, whether I agree with you or not, and then I need to make sure that I convey their opponent's side, whether I agree with them or not. And usually I would say when I would get calls and someone would be mad at me from this side of the story, and the same story, someone would be mad at me for exactly the opposite reason. I thought, well, I probably told a pretty fair story if both sides were upset about it. But in this climate where you can pick and choose that information so much, people just tune out immediately what they don't want to hear. And I think somebody on Facebook said some comment, I don't even know what the story was, but somebody sent me a screenshot of it that said, oh, well, don't let Alyssa cover that because she'll something for Trump. And I'm not even the one writing the stories sometimes that I anchor. They're national stories that we're airing, but it's my fault. So we are definitely being demonized as journalists for saying anything that is not what they want us to say for their side of the story. I've covered President Obama when he was a senator at the time in his first campaign. He came to town, and I got to interview him and his whole family, actually. He has very soft hands, by the way. That's my random little tidbit with Barack Obama. Bernie Sanders covered his rallies when he was running, and we played basketball beforehand. He was playing basketball with all the members of media, and for being accused of being a socialist, he did not share the ball very well. But it was always interesting to see the different crowds at those events. And for the Trump rallies that I've been to, where the fake news was his line, at one of the rallies, he had everybody in that 5,000 people state fair, full fairground, turn around to the risers where the media was standing in the back of the room and boo us. And I cannot tell you how uncomfortable that felt. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, Alyssa Ivanson, WANE-TV, who has not done anything for or against any political candidate, I am trying to time out my sound bites for a city council race. That's what my perspective is. And then to be called all these names by thousands of people. And I think that that is very dangerous because we are trying to give fair and balanced and equal information. And I know that some of the 24-hour networks are not the same, and we get lumped into that same category constantly. But I can control what I put on TV, and I can control the stories that I tell. And so I work very hard to be overly fair and overly balanced, but it is scary when we get yelled at on the street for stories that weren't even out of our station or even out of our city. And so it's a very changing climate with political coverage, I think, for journalists now.
Thank you, Alyssa. Angelica?
Good evening. So a lot of the points that Alyssa made, I echo them. I've certainly been at, President Trump's rally, when before he was president, and been booed, and it's quite an uncomfortable situation. We're talking, a lot about politics, and a lot more people are paying attention to what's going on politically, especially because this is the year of a presidential election. We've had some major things happen over this year between, the coronavirus, COVID-19, and the decisions that were made around that. We've had, the rallies over, George Floyd and other people who died, perhaps at the hands of police. And so, in the 5 years that I've worked here, I've covered everything from, especially when I worked nightside, city council ordinances or their budgets or, the restrictions they may want to place on a gentleman's club, all the way to, covering these election night watch parties and issues or concerns that people have about maybe prosecuting homicides. I mean, these are all political issues because we put these people in office. And so I think also to echo what Alyssa said, we're kind of in what I call this era of fake news because people are, accusing journalists of being fake news. I mean, I've been in grocery stores and someone says, oh, you're a reporter at WANE-15? Yeah. She's like, are you a fake news reporter? And I'm like, no, I wouldn't think so. But, so we're in a time where we have to be more intentional than ever about getting the facts right, about slowing down and paying attention to what we're doing and how we're doing it. As reporters, we have the power to change the way a story is perceived by the words that we use, by the tone of voice that we say it in, by our expressions and our body language, the way we string together sound bites if we get one side but not the other side. So it's more important than ever to be, to pay close attention to that. And especially because we have, like some others have mentioned, we have a lot of, you know, when you say the media, that's not just people on TV. Things and websites that appear on social media are the media too. And sometimes it's hard for people to decipher between what's real and not, and this whole spread of misinformation from websites that appear to be legitimate. So I mean, it's really a tough time. But I mean, it's not just with the presidential election or what the president is saying. I mean, it starts, you know, in our community with what, you know, our city council members are deciding to do and holding them accountable too. So it's certainly been an interesting time, you know, to be a reporter and now going into this next presidential election. But yeah, I just think the biggest thing for me is just always being very intentional about the words you use and the things that you say, because it has the power to make or break, you know, the way someone feels about a politician, a issue, and different things like that. So that's kind of my take and my experience as it pertains to politics, political coverage.
Thank you, Angelica. Sherry?
Well, it occurs to me when I look down this road that I'm young enough to be, or old enough to be, a couple of generations on some of these folks. I am old enough, as I was talking with an unhappy reader earlier today, I'm old enough to remember the late 60s, and luckily so was this reader. For those who are not old enough to remember that, when people say there has never been a more divisive time in this country, I would argue with them. We were in the middle of civil rights, women's rights, a god-awful war in Vietnam, and it was every bit as divisive from an issue standpoint as what we are dealing with today. The difference, and this is a huge difference, is that at the time there were, you know, much fewer network news channels, no specialty news channels. More people got their news from, I'm going to use the term mass media, and at the time that was newspapers and magazines. And their social media was not even on the wall. So there are a couple of things that have changed as we've added to that mix. And I am not someone who thinks that more media options are a bad thing. I don't think they are. I do think if you combine more media outlets, especially ones that are focused on marketing, on those who are more interested in storytelling and conspiracy theories than just telling you what's going on, and you add to that either a laziness or an unwillingness to listen to other viewpoints, then we get into some pretty scary times that are different than what I remember when I got into this business 40 plus years ago. I've had the luxury over those years of working all over the country in newspapers, large and small, in chain operations, in privately owned ones, in union shops and non-union shops, from Southern California, where if something's 100 years old, it's ancient, to York, Pennsylvania, which if you aren't 200 years old, a reader there once told me, there's no reason to cover it, because it'll go away. So it is if you expose yourself to the readers and to the community and to the culture in that area, you learn a lot about this country, and you learn a lot about not generalizing. It's also true that as we've, over the last 40 years, that some of the, in my opinion, either least reliable or least interested in telling more of a complete story are media that aren't necessarily, either they're struggling or they're having financial issues. It is expensive to run a newspaper. It is expensive to run presses. And as we have increased our price over those 40 years, as a family-owned newspaper in Indiana, I know we have priced some people out of the market. I know we have. Now, I've also talked to people who say, you know, I can get it on TV for free. Well, with rare exception, you're getting most of those channels on cable, so it's not really free, but you're paying somebody else, so it seems free. But that's definitely not true for social media. And there are a number of social media outlets. Certainly there's no fee attached to most of them. They don't have the editing checks. They don't have some of the other expenses that newspapers and TV stations, especially local ones, invest. And I'm not going to smear nationals because I think some of them do an excellent job too. It's just they have a much bigger canvas that they have to cover than we do. But it absolutely drives me crazy to see someone post something on Facebook and start with, I'm not sure if this is true. Well, then what the hell are you doing? Why are you sharing something that you know may not be true? And it's almost daily that you get a post like that. And I'm pretty careful who my friends are, so it's really disappointing when my friends are posting stuff like that. So I think there's hope because this is not the most divisive time this country has ever been through. I don't want to go back to the Civil War because that makes even me feel old. But we have been through times like this. We have been through times that split families, split generations, and we managed to get to the other side. But we did it because there was some reliable, credible source of news. And I think one of the scary parts of what's going on now is that long after Trump is out of office, whether it's 4 years from now or January, long after probably the next president is out of office, the media situation, whether we're talking about the proliferation of 24/7 cable news broadcasts that's been, you know, on one, I did a quick audit on a weekday, which is not a be-all and end-all, but I'm used to doing content audits, mostly on our newspaper, but I did a content audit, and I think there were 4 hours of actual news. The rest of it was all talking heads and commentary. And it's not necessarily presented as commentary, but that's what it was. And so I think the best thing we can do if we want to get to the other side of this, if we want to pull our country together, is just be a lot more discerning about where we're going for news and make sure we're going to multiple places for news. The reader asked me today, and he was a 78-year-old man. He was very sweet. He said, how do I know if I'm in a bad place? And I said, well, I know that news is bad, but certainly information can be compromised. If all you're hearing is one side when you're listening, if you never hear anything good about the other side, if you never hear anything bad about the side that you think you're on, then you definitely need to find some other source to listen to and make things a little broader. And I think that's something that everyone can do. I spend probably 4 hours a day with it on the background, and I'll do CNN for an hour, and I'll do Fox for an hour, and I'll do MSNBC for probably 45 minutes, and I'll spend some time with BBC World, which if you get Comcast, I'm assuming you can get it on other places as well, but I know you can get it on Comcast. And it's helpful to see what people are thinking in Mexico or Israel, or don't get as much out of Russia, but you get some stuff out of Eastern Europe. And I think it's healthy for the U.S. to realize how we're being portrayed in other parts of the world. And I think that's probably as good a segue as you're going to get into where we're going next.
That was beautiful. That was beautiful. I'm sitting here thinking, oh, she did it beautifully. Yeah, so as Sherry said, it's so important to understand how various countries around the world are portraying America and specifically American politics. So we pulled some headlines that have been published across the globe. Some were published today, some have been published within the past week. But we're going to show these different headlines and have just a brief discussion, informal discussion about each of the headlines. So this first one came from the UK. It was published today on bbc.com. So the headline read, "Top US Scientist Says Trump Ad, quote, misleading." So just to give a little bit of background information here, Trump recently put out a campaign ad, and in that ad he showed Dr. Anthony Fauci praising Donald Trump, but Anthony Fauci says that that was taken out of context and he was actually talking about his own work, not Donald Trump. So this was the headline that the UK published. Does any panelist member have thoughts, perspective on this headline, want to say anything? And the audience too, if you would like to chime in or say anything as well, please feel free. And we do have some people online watching the live stream, so if there's any thought or comment, I'd be happy to read that out as well.
I think that I've seen that headline in various forms today and yesterday in U.S. media as well, so I don't know if that BBC.com tends to be, while it's a global website, I found that BBC.com tends to be a little bit more skewed toward American, Canadian, North American audience than the UK one. But it's a pretty fair headline, and it seems to be a pretty consistent headline and not terribly different with what we're seeing today and yesterday in U.S. media.
And I don't think it should be a surprise that that the BBC would be paying attention to this story. I mean, they had an issue with Johnson and their own kind of version of Donald Trump. So I don't think it should be a big surprise that they would pick up on this story. I also don't know how many folks know this, but usually when we get a wire feed, and I can use Associated Press as an example, or Washington Post, which we don't use anymore, but usually when we get a wire feed, you not only get, the first paragraph of 350 stories that you can pull up and look at, but those stories also have I won't say it's a suggested headline, but it's their headline to help you understand what that story's about, so you know if you want to spend time opening that particular story. So I also think over the last, I don't know how long that practice has been going on, but I think particularly over the last decade plus, you're probably seeing more and more headlines that look the same, because as people have cut back on their desk staff and the number of people actually processing the copy and getting it ready for you, I suspect more of those suggested headlines or sample headlines at the top of the stories are getting used.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. Any other thoughts? Yeah, Angelica?
Just to kind of add to it, we talked a little bit about this, but a headline like that could be factual and fair. But to like Alyssa's point, if someone doesn't agree or they feel like that's an attack on the president, or, like we're calling him a liar, they'll think that that's fake news. And so especially as we've seen, how the coronavirus and all this has been handled, we've seen headlines about the way that, President Trump and Dr. Fauci have kind of not been on one accord with a lot of different issues. A lot of people have taken a stance. Are we going to go with what the doctor says, or are we going to go with what the president says? And so when you look at a headline like that's fair, as we've talked about, some people wouldn't consider it so, just because they're taking the side of one person or the other.
And I found a lot of people read the headline and stop. They don't read the story. I can't tell you how many times I've posted links to stories on my Facebook page, and the first 3 comments are answered in the first sentence of the story if they would take the time to read the story. And sometimes I'll comment back and I'll copy and paste from the article. I get snarky. But so if all you're reading is the headline and you're extrapolating what you want to from the headline, we almost can't win.
Yeah, this one struck me as, when I first looked at it in the context of the others that I know we're going to look at, it seemed factual, it seemed straightforward in a way that I would expect from the BBC. But I was struck a little bit, I think to your point, Alyssa, that they're contrasting a top scientist and Trump, right? And so the way you characterize some of that, I think, is reflective of whether it's something that's going to be further in the story or not, just sort of the value of who you're talking about. And so you could see in some ways, the BBC is giving credence to Dr. Fauci, which in this case, he himself spoke up about this and said that does not reflect my words. And they were giving him his due as what they see as America's top scientist, and not in anything other than a factual way, but some of that will start to drive the reaction that you all get when you post things.
Thank you. All right, we'll move on to the next headline. So this came from Kenya. It was published today, and I actually found it on the Daily Nation, which is a large newspaper there in Kenya. But their headline read, Michelle Obama brands Trump racist in scalding video. So Michelle Obama published this 24-minute video basically supporting Joe Biden and described Trump and his Republican allies as unfairly stoking fears about African Americans in the video. Any thoughts on this headline?
So some of my first thoughts with this, and I did not see the full 24-minute video, so I don't know if she used the word racist or not, or if that was the reporter's interpretation of the message of her video. And so going back to me being very careful in word choice, if it didn't come out of their mouth, sometimes I don't want to say it. And yes, if it's a feature story about a woman loving kittens, then I could say that she's obsessed with kittens. You can just figure out what the story is. But in politics especially, I don't think that is where you can insert other words. Scalding video, that's an opinion. It might be a scalding video, but let the viewer decide what the video is. So I had an issue with those two words. And even branding is kind of a charged word instead of says. So my headlines are very boring sometimes, newspaper people. But it's because it's what that person told me, and I'm going to give you a summary of what the story is, but I'm not going to insert other flowery words. So that's what stood out to me for this one.
Yeah. Any other thoughts from our panel?
For this one, I also started to think about in terms of how the world is looking at us and what they cover. When you see that this was a headline that ran fairly recently in Kenya, and it was highlighting Michelle Obama, some of the context of that too, that I know would be newsworthy in Kenya is that President Obama's father was from Kenya. And so that might heighten the interest in something that Michelle Obama talks about and how she's still influential in American politics and is a leader. And it's also within the context of what other countries are going to tend to hone in on. It'll be things within our leadership that may ultimately affect them. And so this was, to me, sort of a combination of those things. And I agree, it did, the choice of the word brand and other things seemed to be particularly strong as far as, to me, sort of supporting maybe the overall point that she was trying to make, if not the language she was using.
I didn't look up to see if this was like the context for the story, if this was a news story or what might be characterized more as an opinion piece from the Daily Nation. Another thing, kind of the context of American politics globally, is the administration, Trump's comments over the last couple of years about people who immigrate here from certain types of countries, we won't repeat the word, that he perceives to be that type of country. And I believe in the context of that, he was referring to countries in the continent of Africa. And so there might be a little less patience for his rhetoric still editorializing, but there's other countries do have a different standard of, like there's a very American style, like Alyssa was explaining, of how we report the news, what we say, what we don't say. And while an English language paper in a foreign country might model that to a point, they might not feel the same constraints that we feel, even though it may look similar.
I also think even in this country, it's getting harder for people to understand the difference between news and editorial, which is so basic to me that I don't understand, even when I talk to older readers who surely remember that there's a divide between what's on the news columns of the newspaper or the TV station and what's clearly labeled an opinion piece or clearly appears on our opinion page. And I'll get back, but it's not, you don't have the other side there. Well, it's the opinion page, and you know, if it's our opinion, unless someone else has written an op-ed, and we are very careful to get all of those in. Or we have, the letter writer today's big concern was that there seemed to be more anti-Trump letters than pro-Trump letters. And as I explained to him, we're running everything we're getting. So I'm sorry, but he said, well, that's not balanced. You should hold out some of the other ones. And it's like, no, it's an opinion page. It's a place for, in this case, our community to voice their opinions on things. And I'm not going to edit it just because I have two on one side and only one on the other side. So there's just a strange disconnect that if they read it anywhere in the paper, then somehow it ought to be fair and balanced. And the idea that someone could have an opinion and that we would, as this guy said today, waste space to let them express it is becoming a foreign concept, which I think is just really sad, because I think the most important thing we do, one of the most important things we do is give voice to readers. And if they don't put it there, I don't know where they can put it on social media, but then they're just reaching their friends. So I think that's really important, and I think that's kind of sad.
All right, thank you. Let's move on to, this is probably the last one we'll have time for, because I do want to leave some minutes at the end for questions. So this headline came from Syria, and it came from the outlet Tijreen, and it was published today. Just to give a background, ambassadors from Syria and Cuba met today and discussed their unilateral partnership. And Sabah is an ambassador from Syria. He said the coercive Western measures imposed on Syria and Cuba are aimed at undermining their independent decision. And he basically added to that, saying the danger of the false slogans raised by the United States under the names of combating terrorism and promoting democracy with the aim of stealing the wealth of people. Any thoughts on this headline from Syria?
I did a little research on Tijreen, not a lot, but a little. It has had a history of some Holocaust denying, so I don't know enough about the newspaper or the outlet to say that I would feel comfortable labeling it a true global media, but it is a voice for that community. One of the things that strikes me about the choice of countries, Syria and Cuba, we do know that Russian state actors are very involved in Syria. We know that Cuba has a history of being a satellite state of the former Soviet bloc. So I don't know if that's kind of coming from there, if it's, but there is also the Western versus Eastern concerns. And I know that there is concerns in other countries about the way the West, which would be us and other Western European countries in particular, view what's going on in Eastern countries. which Syria would kind of be based on the nature of its religious practice and cultural practice. But I don't know if that makes any sense at all, but I'm cautious in general to see that as an example of global media that would be digested in Western countries or even more modern Eastern countries, or freer Eastern countries.
Any other thoughts on this headline?
I would just say on the actual structure of it being set up as a quote from the ambassador, correct? I think that if that is exactly what he said, or pretty much exactly what he said, then it's not misleading if that is what he said. However, because it's the headline, it also feels like the paper is telling you that. So that can be a tactic. Now, we'll do that all the time. Police, guy was strung out on meth when he jumped off the cliff. You know, something like that. But that's not editorializing, and again, it's not a political story, and I feel like you just have to use caution in how you're presenting who gets top billing. So this person's idea as the headline is the top idea of the story, even if there is an opposing view later in the story. So just for the structure of the headline, that's my thought.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from the panel?
This is an operation that is a Holocaust denier. I don't know that you need to know a lot more about it to, I mean, I don't know how much time we need to spend on dissecting why they said what they said. These are countries that the U.S. has, that we have had issues with, that the U.S. has had issues with, that we have sanctioned, that we have boycotted. So the fact that they would be hostile to us and that would be the way they present something to their people just doesn't surprise me at all.
What Sherry said. Yeah. All right, we just have a few more minutes left, and we do have some questions coming in for the live feed. But before I read those, does anybody in our audience have any questions for our panel? Do you have a question? No? Okay. So we do have a question from the live stream. Are journalists violating their professional ethics or integrity when they do not ask the tough questions to their interviewees? Who wants to tackle that one?
I would say, I mean, ethics and integrity is one column, but also just job duty is another, and our job is to ask the tough questions and to hold people accountable, and that's why we're called the fourth estate, because we are the watchdogs. So I think you're violating your ethics and integrity if you skew a story, and I think you're violating your job duties if you don't ask the questions.
Anybody want to add to that? Or
I can't improve on that. That was yeah, that.
yeah, that was really good. Any other questions from our live chat or from our audience? Okay, well, I just want to thank our panelists for being here this evening. I know you all work tirelessly throughout your days, and I can just think for myself, I appreciate all of the work that you do. Like you said, being the watchdog and bringing us accurate information, objective information. It's so valuable and so important. And I thank you for doing that tirelessly. I know you guys work so many hours and you don't have the typical 9-to-5 job. So we really do appreciate all of the work that you do and for coming here this evening and sharing your perspectives with us. So thank you very much. Thank you for attending, and thank you for watching if you're on the live stream. Thank you. This concludes our event.